Okay, we'd like to get started with our lunchtime speaker. I'm Jamie Van Ostrand. I direct the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development here at the law school. And it's my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Van Ostrand, who's the director of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Public Health Training Center, and she's going to be introducing our lunchtime keynote speaker. Professor Van Ostrand, would you like to?
Thank you. Yes, there is a little bit of nepotism going on here. I first wanted to address the question about what is a public health lawyer, since I am one. I will give you an example of what a public health lawyer does. By definition, a public health lawyer is someone who looks at legal and policy implications that affect population's health. So last week, I received a grant award from the CDC to look at interventions given by problem-solving courts to people who are suffering from substance use disorder. So problem-solving courts are things like veterans courts and adult drug courts, and at least in theory, they're supposed to give people more interventions when they are incarcerated than the general prison population. So we're going to see if any one of these interventions or a cocktail of interventions affect either non-fatal or fatal opioid misuse events. So that's an example of what a public health lawyer does. Okay, so I am Elizabeth Van Ostrand, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm actually here in two different capacities. One as the director of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Public Health Training Center, who is a co-sponsor of this tremendous event. But I'm also an associate professor of health policy and in the Department of Health Policy and Management at Pitt Public Health. And it is in that role that I came to know Dr. Bernardi Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein's accomplishments and accolades are legion. As an academic, as a practitioner, as a clinician, and as an advocate. But you can go home and Google Dr. Bernardi Goldstein and read one of his 239 some publications or 73 books or book chapters, or watch one of his dozens of taped interviews. Believe me, you'll be amazed. But right now, I'd just like to take a few moments to talk to you about my friend Bernie. I first met Bernie shortly after I started working at Pitt Public Health, and he was stepping down as its dean. We both officed on the same floor, and I didn't know who he was, but I noticed this very energetic, smiley man who would always stop to say good morning to me and to everyone else, which is not always a common occurrence in academia. I think we first started chatting by our mutual friend Rhonda's Candy Bowl. Rhonda is an administrative assistant at Pitt Public Health, and it was during this time that I learned that Bernie not only has a fondness for peanut butter cups, but he also has the ability to drop and give you 20 upon request. Bernie's charismatic personality is undeniable, and he always has great stories about when he practiced medicine in New York City or working in the Reagan administration, or perhaps most interestingly, hiking. Bernie and I share a common passion for hiking, and even though we both travel a lot professionally, it is Bernie who tends to land the speaking engagements that are near some really cool and interesting hiking trails. I want to share a pivotal moment in our professional and personal relationship that happened about 7 years ago when Bernie asked me to lunch. During the lunch, he shared with me his concerns about the possible public health implications associated with unconventional shale gas development or fracking. As a former litigator whose clients included AT&T and Delta Airlines, I had virtually no experience in the environmental space, and I was just starting to feel comfortable with public health and public health issues. I sat quietly and muttered an occasional like, oh wow, when he was talking, but I was thinking, man, am I out of my league. When he saw my eyes glazing over, he very patiently took out a piece of paper and started sketching a well pad and patiently explained to me what the hydraulic fracking processes and its components were to me. Since that lunch, Bernie and I have collaborated on several projects involving fracking in public health, including an article published in the Notre Dame Journal of Law that urges a slowdown in the industry until legal protections are in place that can catch up to the science. I owe Bernie an enormous amount of thanks, not only for opening my eyes to this critically important domain, but also educating me now so that I can kind of sort of talk the climate change talk with my environmental law husband, Jamie Van Ostrand. So you've really helped me out at the dinner table, Bernie. Thank you for allowing me to tell you just a wee bit about my friend, colleague, mentor, and hero, Dr. Bernardi Goldstein.
Wow. I'd asked Elizabeth not to give me such a flowery introduction, and I told her I'd get even. So I actually have an opportunity to do that. It was, I don't know if you've been noticing this slide up there. I got involved in global climate change when I was at EPA in 1983 to 85. This was a time when President Reagan had thrown out Ann Gorsuch and the mother of Neil Gorsuch, and had brought in Bill Ruckelshaus, and I was asked to run research and development. And President Reagan actually gave money to EPA to look at global climate change. Well, at the time, I also had to suddenly give lots of talks to public groups, which as an academic, I had never really done before, things like this. And as an academic at the time, this is a long time ago, this is what, 35 years ago, what we did in academia was to always start our talks with a picture of some famous person that epitomized what we were talking about. So in medicine, in my medical school, might be Hippocrates or Galen or someone like that. And I decided I needed someone to epitomize the use of toxicological sciences for governmental purposes. And it turns out that this person, is this an ancestor of yours? Looks very much like you. Don't you think you do know who this is, right? Epitomizing toxicological sciences for governmental purposes, a very effective person who was able to do that is Lucretia Borgia, right? I mean, yeah, she basically used poisons. And it basically, she only had to deal with her brother, Cesare, who was head of Rome, and the Pope, who was another relative, and they made the decisions themselves. There was no Congress. There was no newspaper reporters. There was no scientists out there who would basically tell her she might be right or wrong. That's the way it was. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that's the way it's going back. We're getting a lot of single-handed responses to our environmental problems, of which global climate change is so important, that bring us back to an era of the past. So I'm going to start by thanking you all for these great presentations, and particularly thanking Dr. Van Susteren and Dr. Clayton, because they told you to listen. And I was really scared about this title. I changed it back and forth a couple of times. By listening to Donald Trump, I don't mean heeding Donald Trump, but I mean we've got to do a better job of listening to what he says and to whom he's speaking to and to why he's speaking to them in that way. Because a non-political statement, because I'm a scientist, I don't make political statements, but if we don't get this guy not elected for the next term, things are going to get worse in all of the different issues I'm going to be talking about. So here's the poster child. I must say that I've got a very weak connection with him. We're both New Yorkers, so we both hate to lose, and that's a large part of where he's coming from. And his big brother and I actually played on the same police athletic league baseball team in Queens way back when. I'm going to argue that we need to pay a better attention to the so what issue, that we in public health have gotten into this issue much too late. In terms of my not liking to lose, I can tell you that a battle I lost when I was at EPA, when President Reagan gave us that money, I wanted to put that money into a so what issue that we could do pretty quickly. And that was, we had greenhouses in one of our laboratories in Corvallis, Oregon. We could look at what would happen with more carbon dioxide. And these greenhouses were equipped so you could put ozone in it, you could put nitrogen oxide in it, you could see what happened to the growth of agricultural products. And we lost out to the Air Office, who wanted to build another model to look at levels of carbon dioxide. Now, models were being built by lots of other agencies. I thought EPA lost a very major chance to get into the so what issue. I think we've done a pretty poor job of the so what issue. I mean, what does the public really care about the number of molecules of carbon dioxide in the air? Molecules of methane, even such a thing as sea level rise, melting glaciers, these are far removed from the public health issues which we've heard of so much about today, which really should have been at the forefront much earlier. But it's not too late, and we're getting there. And I must tell you, spending too much time in Washington and getting very depressed, and I mean that in the terms that were used by our previous speaker, there's nothing more invigorating to me, more of a response to that depression to be in a meeting like this, to see what's been happening in the past couple of days with young people. That's the response that we need. But we still haven't quite gotten this issue of speaking to the public. We're using the terms now adaptation and mitigation. Those are the kind of words that get us into trouble. They're words that seem to have public meaning, but we're using them in very specific ways. We don't have trouble with the public when we say 2,3,7,8 hexamethyl whatever, because people are going to say, well, what is that? We do have trouble when we use terms like adaptation and mitigation, and I can tell you I've looked it up a couple of times to be sure I was using the terms appropriately. It's a very nice approach by the Union of Concerned Scientists, very nice toward climate resilience, and again, adaptation is part of it. Stop using those words, find better ways to explain what we mean. I like the public health approach because, again, people ask me what we mean. We talk about primary prevention and secondary prevention and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention, it doesn't happen in the first place. We've got to make sure we lessen carbon dioxide, et cetera. Secondary prevention is, well, it's happening, what should we do about it? And the examples have already, we'll discover you've got high blood pressure, we will cut down the salt, which makes the high blood pressure, we'll also give you a medicine, which is secondary prevention to lower it. These are the kind of examples one can use and should be using here rather than focusing on words which are, seem to be meaningful but really aren't, at least to the general public. I made some assumptions about you in coming to give this talk, and I won't ask, a previous speaker asked, I'm going to make the assumption none of you have read President Trump's speech when he announced that the U.S. is leaving the Paris Agreement. And I hope I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. I'm also convinced that almost all of you believe that global climate change is occurring and is having public health effects. I say almost because industry is very good, the fossil fuel industry, about having members at representatives at meetings like this to hear what people are saying. We're not very good about listening to the other side, if you will. I think probably if we raise, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, that a lot of you would qualify as elitist foodies, and none of us like to think of us elitist, but what the farmers would call elitist foodies. And I think perhaps relatively few of you, compared to the general population, have families with recent military experience. What's that mean? Well, if I get to the end of the talk and the time allowed, I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so what did that speech say? Well, first, what's the context? The major underlying consideration of all first-term presidents, President Obama, President Clinton, whatever, is re-election. Uh, Ronald Reagan got rid of Ann Gorsuch because it was going to hurt his chance for re-election. The polls show that people were concerned about the environment and that people would vote on it. He would lose independent voters. Neil Gorsuch said in one of his interviews that he learned all he needed to know about politics when he was a teenager, and his mother got fired because his mother did nothing except what Ronald Reagan wanted her to do. And Reagan said very little different than what Trump has said in the election run-up. Trump has done something different. Basically, before the Paris Agreement withdrawal, there was news accounts of debates within the White House. Ivanka, Rex Tillerson said, stay in. Steve Bannon said, let's leave. We got to leave. I'm willing to bet that the debate was about how does it affect my reelection. And the decision to withdraw from Paris was a decision that basically said, I'm going to depend upon my base that got me here. Those are the people we have to talk to. And we can talk to them, and we haven't talked to them. He also has another, President Trump has another reason for doing a lot of what he did. If President Obama did it, it must be wrong, so he will change that. Look, what didn't he say? If you read that speech, and it's a long speech, there's no mention of global climate change. He doesn't say whether it's happening, not happening, or anything of that nature. It's all about how the rest of the world is screwing us, and it was a lousy agreement. How the United States is being taken as a chump for agreeing to something like this, and it's putting us in enormous debt, and it's going to hurt us in the long run. He talks about legal and constitutional issues, and there was a question asked about the Constitution earlier, so let me go into that. Basically, what he says is that others outside of the United States should not tell us what to do on our own soil. And he gets our withdrawal from the agreement represents a reassertion of America's sovereignty. That you got to pause for that. Now, these emphases and underlines are my own. Our Constitution is unique among all the nations of the world. Was it really unique? Well, do I really have my slides in order? Yeah, it's been around a very long time compared to others. It's got reserve powers, which really are important in terms of the environment and public health. Almost every constitution in the world specifies what goes to the states, the Länder, the provinces. And anything that isn't specified stays with the central government. Ours is the reverse. We specify what goes to the central government, to the federal government, and everything else belongs to the states. And that includes environment and public health. There's nothing there that says that the federal government should do that. And that gets into a lot of issues as you do environmental public health. It also is an opportunity, in a sense, and it's an opportunity that's being taken at the state and local level where we see so much being done on global climate change, despite the absence of any federal support for it. It's also very difficult to amend. It'd be nice to put an environmental amendment, and I know Pennsylvania has one. I don't know it to Pennsylvania's constitution. I don't know about West Virginia. I should have looked about that. A particularly important one, as you look at some of these issues, has to do with property rights. It's a constitutional guarantee of property rights, and I gotta go backwards. The primacy of property rights is, if you look at the right-wing websites that are against sustainability and against global climate change, you will find over and over again these kind of quotes. You'll find even more. These are ones I'm able to verify, but John Adams saying that property is not as sacred as the laws of God. It will be a place where we won't be able to protect ourselves against anarchy and tyranny. Jefferson about our other rights would mean little without their rights of property ownership. Madison, property, that alone is a just government which impartially secures to every man, doesn't say woman, whatever is his own. And Noah Webster about that all these other things that we think are so important are really inferior to the importance of property. So people who are strict constitutionalists, who depend upon our Constitution, are conservatives, basically keep going back to that. And they have a fear that sustainability, that global climate change is just an attempt to take away basic constitutional rights that they have to their property. If you look at the Republican Party platforms, I don't know how readable this is, but if you start looking and follow the platforms, they move from basically saying the defense of property rights is really where we need to be because property rights are so important to environmental protection. And they derived this from some work by Garrett Hardin and by others on basically what's called the tragedy of the commons, where if you have some common grazing land and everybody is allowed to put as many cows or sheep as they want on it, eventually the grazing land will degrade, and the individual still has an advantage of putting one more cow on there. So you need private property to prevent this. And a lot of Republican environmentalism, and there's a lot of Republican environmentalism in the past, has come out of that type of belief. By 2012, you're seeing a much more defensive approach, basically saying we're going to protect private property against this encroachment by environmentalists. And if you talk to people about this, you will find that there's a concern that it goes beyond that. It goes into the issue of whether or not Agenda 21 will be included in this thing. And Agenda 21 is the UN Stockholm meeting's definition of sustainability. That this attack on private property, you want to put bike lanes through my front lawn? That's right on the Mississippi River. This is an issue going on in Minnesota right now. Why? Because it's going to save cars being used? No, that's not a good enough reason to take away my access to the Mississippi River, at least strangers on my front lawn. The state of Alabama has passed a law saying that Agenda 21 cannot be the basis for any actions on a property level or on planning levels. A planning program for their Baldwin County in Alabama, which was going on for many years with Republicans and Democrats and every, community meetings and everything. What should our planning be? This is the fastest growing county in Alabama. Just ended up in disarray. There's a paper in a California planning journal saying, listen, this is the state of what's going to be. We're going to have to deal with people who believe that anything having to do with sustainability is an assault on their property rights. And we need to take that into account as we go through planning processes. So these are real things that are having real impact. This is something that my colleague and I wrote a paper about this, looking at the Republican Party candidates in 2012 and to see whether their platforms or their speeches talked about property rights and all, and almost half of them did, and a few of them even talked about this Agenda 21 issue. Donald Trump was not concerned about property rights. In fact, he was criticized for not being concerned about it. Well, he's a developer. He wants to be able to get lots of land together, be able to use eminent domain, and basically someone who did not care about that, but his constituents do. We heard a bit about waters of the U.S. as an issue. If you've been following this issue, this is an attempt by the Obama administration originally to change the definition of whether land that has water on it for part of the year, how much of the land, how much during the year could be regulated through the Clean Water Act rather than through state or no regulation at all. There is a genuine concern about that among people who are not necessarily those who are making money directly from this. This is not a Koch brothers kind of thing. This is a genuine concern by people who really worry about their property rights. And when basically EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers changed their regulations, the Congress, which can do this at any time it wants, basically said you can't do that, passed a provision saying you can't do that. President Obama vetoed it. It was only, I think he only made 9 vetoes in his 8 years in office, so a veto from him was pretty uncommon. But he vetoed that, saying we need to keep our water clean, to keep it free from pollution. Here's Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, who is the Senate leader of the Republicans in this. And she says we all want clean water. This rule is not about clean water. Rather, it is about how much authority the federal government and unelected bureaucrats should have to regulate what is done on private land. That is something that has to be taken into account. We have to understand that people are genuinely concerned about it. They have what they believe is a constitutional right to be concerned about it, and that's not going to go away. We have to be able to listen to that and be able to respond to that. What else did Trump say? Well, he talks about how many jobs we could lose and the cost of the economy and all these kind of numbers, which he gets from the National Economic Research Associates. This is not the National Academy of Sciences. This is a consultant group that works for industry, provides all sorts of good news to coal miners and others about how coal is so important, and it has a very consistent, if you will, political position. Why would the President of the United States choose that person rather than what we've had for years and years in our country, which is a peer structure of science to bring in the best scientific consensus established by President Lincoln, the National Academy of Sciences? That's traditionally what we ask for this. Well, this brings me to the opportunity to be able to talk a bit about how we bring the science into EPA's processes. And these are some slides I developed 1985 when I left EPA to try to summarize the activities. And basically what this is assuming that for something like, say, could be the ozone standard, what's the level of ozone that causes adverse effects on which the standard is supposed to be based. There's a Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee required by Congress to come up with a judgment as to what that number is, on which then the administrator decides what the standard ought to be. And there's a little wiggle room in there. And what I've assumed is, say, there's 1,000 scientists out there who individually are knowledgeable about ozone. And if you ask them to do this individually, just sitting from their own desk and give a number, it would pile up like this. Most would be in the middle, some would be on one end, some would be the other, but it fits sort of a bell-shaped curve. And I've also put 6 X's in there. Those are the members of the consensus committee. They've been chosen because of balancing their expertise, their previous statements, who they work for, anything else you can do to make the balance. And they're the ones who are the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. Actually, there's 7 members. I don't know why I use 6. But what I've done, though, is if you look at those 2 arrows on top, let's see if this works. Yeah, the angle is such I couldn't show. If you look at those 2 yellow arrows, what you do sitting around as a committee and a bunch of scientists sitting around a table like this trying to discuss this is you tend to defer to each other. Oh, you're more of a toxicologist, I'm more of an epidemiologist, and you don't want to be the one person who's out in the corner when the other members are in the center, because you don't want to lose your scientific reputation. And these are your peers on there. So we tend to huddle together. Not always, but we tend to huddle together. At the EPA, this is going on at the same time one other process is going on. That's the legal process. That's confrontational. That should be confrontational. Sometimes when I talk just about this, I show a picture of Johnny Cochran. Remember him, Cochran? He was OJ's lawyer. He's the guy I want to defend me. I mean, it's an adversarial process. I want only the best information on my side to be put forward by someone who's a really good lawyer and a really good advocate. Right now, sometime this week, there'll be a moot court here at the law school. At that moot court, a student will present, knowing their reputation, their grade is at stake, will be taking one side of a case, and if that student provides information that's valuable to the other side, before the other side brings it up, that student's in trouble. Doesn't do as well. At the medical school, somebody's doing a thesis, or School of Public Health, somebody's presenting a thesis. If they do not present the data suggesting that they might be wrong, they will be marked down. It's a completely different approach to how you handle the science that's available. EPA doesn't both. What we have now, however, is a situation in which this has been completely distorted in lots of different ways. One way to be a little pejorative about it is scientists manipulate formulas to match the real world. Policymakers manipulate the real world to match formulas. I've added to that recently something that came out of a superb paper in Science by folks with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Science without policy is science. Policy without science is gambling. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're gambling, and we're gambling where the odds are against us when it comes to global climate change. As an aside, you can talk about the communication of science being the same thing. It's not just an ethical lawyer who's going to take the do the advocacy. An ethical journalist is also trained to balance the story. So it doesn't matter. Maybe there is no center. Maybe there's two opposing groups of scientists. Maybe it's skewed one way or the other way. The balance will end up getting the two extremes, and it will be presented to the public as if there are two extremes and no center. There's something special about EPA that makes it need its science advisory process. The assistant administrator of EPA is a political appointee. I was not only a political appointee of Ronald Reagan, and this time I'll tell you how I got flunked my White House test, but still got there. And, I had to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Okay? That's the same level as the assistant administrator who's in charge of the water or the air. These are, I'm at the same level as the policy person. OSHA was formed in the same year. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration gets its science from NIOSH, which is in a completely different agency. And it's not headed by a senior level person as senior as somebody who goes through Senate confirmation. And OSHA has simply not done as good a job as EPA in developing science-based policies through the years. In fact, in many ways, it's a disgrace how poorly our workers are protected. That's because, I think, in large part, the scientists are right there with the policymakers. But there's a negative aspect of that as well. The policymakers can lean on the scientists. I mean, it's the same oversight committee at OMB that looks at both the science and the policy, and they're going to ask the policymakers, were the scientists helpful? And that's going to determine the science budget. And, you know, you got to be a little helpful, or maybe you want to hire a bunch of molecular biologists, and the administrator says, "Oh yeah, I'm really going to support that but you know, Bernie, we've got this problem here that maybe this might be misinterpreted if this says so strongly that global climate change is coming. Let's tone that down a bit." This doesn't happen between OSHA and NIOSH. They're too far apart from each other. How do you protect against the fact that the scientists are at the beck and call of policymakers within the same agency? Well, you put in strong external advisory committees. The Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee I mentioned was put in 1977 after the 1970 Clean Air Act. After that 7-year period, it became clear that, we needed some way to balance that. So EPA's organizational structure requires external scientific advice, and you can't change that structure directly, but you can change the way the consensus processes are going. So I won't read all this, the time is short, but there's been a dramatic change in the extent to which the science is being used, is being given to the advisory committees and how the advisory committees are structured. If you're a scientist who is really so knowledgeable about EPA's activities, you're an academic scientist, that you can compete for a highly competitive EPA grant in which there's external people deciding who gets funded, you're no longer allowed to give advice to EPA because you must be biased in favor of EPA. They're giving you money, right? Now, if you're a consultant for industry who can get industry jobs if you can basically do things for industry, you're not banned at all. And in fact, if you look at what's happened to the EPA Scientific Advisory Committee membership, you will find that in the past few years, it's been changed so that we have far fewer academics, and those academics are ones who are known to be much more sympathetic to the industry position than we've had in the past. We've got far more consultants than we've had in the past. Further, they've changed the process. Instead of a bunch of people sitting around the table trying to come to a judgment, what we have now is a movement toward a process which says, we have to have an external meeting on this where people can testify about what they think ought to be done. And after that's over, we'll have a chance for a couple of hours to talk among ourselves in a public meeting. And then at the end of the day, what we want is not for you to prepare for the next meeting where we'll come to consensus, it's for you to individually send us your opinions. Well, some of those opinions are going to be in favor of what the administrator of EPA the current administrator wants, because he stacked the deck for those people, and that's the ones you're going to hear about. We did this with the advice of the EPA Science Advisory Board. Nonsense. They did this based upon individuals who were members of the EPA Science Advisory Board. There's something they're doing which is really, I want to be positive about how nefarious this is. I mean, what they've done is to hide behind transparency. Everybody's in favor of transparency in science. It makes sense that there would be transparency. We want to know the data. We don't want anybody to hide the data. But wait a second. What we have is a situation in which EPA has basically said that unless the data is fully transparent to everyone to be able to look at it, we're not going to base our regulations on it. Well, first you're going to have to throw out a whole bunch of old data, which we've come to agreement on, including some of the global science stuff. But also, what does that mean to the individual scientist? What happens to that raw data? Well, it goes to anyone. Who's going to afford to review it? Industry. What are the consultants going to do for industry? They're going to find little holes in it, what we call blemishes, and they're going to make them into scars. Well, maybe there shouldn't be any blemishes. That's not possible. Why is that not possible? I mean, why am I saying to you that transparency, that you can't do the perfect study, you can't do the gold standard study? And the answer is very simple. Let's say all of you have rheumatoid arthritis, and you've all volunteered to take this new pill, okay? Or you get a placebo, and you don't know whether you've got the placebo or the pill, and neither does your doctor. And then after a certain period of time, we will then go break the code and find out whether the pill works. That's what we call the gold standard for epidemiology. It's a randomized, double-blind, controlled trial. We can't do that for environmental pollutants. Half of you want to volunteer to get the pollutant, the other half will give the placebo, but you're not going to know which. Of course, and we take advantage of situations in which there's always going to be some potential for confounding. So the way we replicate is we take one study done in one way because a tanker truck turned over and the pollutants got there, and we do another study on workers who happen to be exposed to it, and we do another, and you have to do a weight of evidence to put all the evidence together. What's happened is we've gotten rid of the weight of evidence approaches. So what I'm telling you is that we no longer are in a position in which we can say that the science coming out from EPA is vetted as it should be, that our standards, our rules are based upon the best available science rather than a biased science. I'm going to go to the agricultural issues and the veterans issues just to finish this off. President Trump is basically in a war with the rest of the world on U.S. trade. One of the trade issues that we haven't quite gotten to yet has to do with agricultural trade. Our farmers are hurting because of the agricultural bans. Some of the major hurt, which once he gets rid of China he's going to go after, is the fact that you cannot sell the beef we had this afternoon if you had it, the roll that you had this afternoon if we had it. You can't sell them into Europe at all. It's not a question of tariffs. It's a question of it's all. Do you have the chicken? Can't sell that either. All three of them are banned by the EU based upon the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is a good public health principle. It correctly puts the burden of proof on somebody who's producing a new chemical to prove it's safe. But that's the opposite of world trade. World trade assumes that globalization is good, trade is good, and if you're going to ban somebody else's product, you have to show it's harmful. So it's a misuse of the World Trade Organization's approaches. Europe has lost every battle with the US on agricultural trade over the World Trade Organization. But these are all issues that, if you will, elite foodies agreed with the Europeans, right? GMO is awful? No. GMO isn't awful. You know why the office, the EU scientists have tried to get a chief science advisor like we have in the United States for years to try to give more presence to science. It was abolished because after they finally formed it, the head of the EU science advisor said there's nothing wrong with GMO. Well, they couldn't fire her because the scientists would be up in arms, so they just abolished the office. There no longer is an office of chief advisor. Every single one of the issues I talked about, whether it be chicken or beef or GMO, the European science folks support the United States position, but Europe keeps out these things. So anytime we're in a situation where it seems like those of us supporting global climate change issues and doing something about sustainability are also claiming that US farmers aren't sustainable or somehow harming people, you're wrong. Don't say it. Because all you do is you get people mad, and you're not showing yourself as being susceptible of listening to the science. We're showing as a cultural issue with a cultural divide that farmers object to. Why are farmers important? Well, 60% of the farmers voted for President Trump. What about the military? You heard the military, threat intensification raised, very important. And there was a bill, and there's been since the Clinton years, there's been funding for global climate change in the Defense Authorization Act. When President Trump came in, Congress solidly in his hands, in the House, a Tea Party congressman basically said, let's get rid of this. There should be put an amendment to strip the Defense Authorization Act of its global climate change piece. That amendment lost because over 40 Republicans joined with the Democrats to defeat the amendment. So it's not an issue which is just Democrats, Republicans. People get it in the military. They get it, as you heard from Dr. Van Susteren, that there are and will be continuing more wars because of this. What's going to happen to those 80 million Egyptians if they can't get food? Where do they go, and what's going to happen in the Middle East then? These are important issues. We need to talk, just as we need to talk to farmers about what's going to happen with farming because of global climate change. We need to talk to veterans and their families, also voted 60-40 for President Trump, about what's happening, about what will happen because of global climate change. So basically, let me finish by saying that talking to these people, listening to them first, and then talking is crucial, as far as I'm concerned, to make the major change, which is to make sure that the president doesn't get reelected. I think we're too focused on polar bears. I fault the very superb NGOs we have who are working so hard on climate change for focusing so much on polar bears. They do so because it's people who care so much about polar bears who are giving them their money, who are joining them. It's not the defense folks, it's not the farmers. But we need to make sure that we all focus on not just the polar bear, but on the people who President Trump is focused on, who has doubled down on to get reelected. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. With that, we're going to resume back over in the moot courtroom with the next panel. A couple thank yous first. I want to thank Samantha Stefanoff, who was very key putting all this together, Lisa Brignoli, James Jolly from our Media and Communications putting the program together. It takes a village to put together a conference like this. I just want to express thanks. And Logan Thorne of Blackwater, the West Virginia Center on Climate Change. And then, of course, Elizabeth Van Osteren from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Public Health Training Center. So see you next door back in the moot courtroom. We'll get started with our next panel. Thanks.